So welcome to this lecture on organic evolution, which is chapter 18 in the book. And we're going to talk about the central claim of the theory of evolution, about how today's organisms are descended with modification from common ancestors. We're going to talk about Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck and his idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. We're going to talk about Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace and how they published their views in 1859 on natural selection as the agent of change in populations. We're going to talk about Gregor Mendel and how Gregor Mendel's work gives us the source of variation, or the idea that there is some material or information that's being acted upon. And he used pea plants, and he talks about blended uh, uh, blended populations of, or blended characteristics during inheritance. And we're going to talk about the modern view of evolution, which would be the modern synthesis. Talk about sexual reproduction and mutations in sex cells, how that accounts for the variation that we see in populations, and how populations evolve rather than individuals. We're going to talk about the fossil record, which we've already talked about. We're going to give examples of macroevolution and then basically show you how that's a cumulative effect of microevolution. We're going to talk about evolutionary trends and different characteristics of organisms. So this is a picture of the famous Darwin finches. And this is one example or an evidence for evolution. And when people ask me about evidence for evolution, I sort of don't know what to tell them, because there's evidence for evolution in every single living organism that we have on planet Earth. So asking for evidence related to evolution is kind of like asking me about evidence for gravity. You obviously aren't flying off the planet, and so you observe it every day, but it's so common that we don't actually think about it as that being evidence or observations of gravity. It's the same thing when we look at the different organisms, all of the different organisms we have on the planet. You're actually, that experience that you're having of the evidence is through observations made by using your eyes, and we stand upright, we have a sense of balance, which are our ears, and all of these experiences are drawn from your environment through organs that evolve through time to supply the observations that you're making about gravity or whatever. So the very question is sort of, it's a sort of a whole ball of wax that, there's evidence in pretty much everything, all the different structures of organisms, including us. So there's evidence for descent with modification from a common ancestor in things like the fossil record, which we've already talked about. Comparative anatomy, which is, we have two eyes, dogs have two eyes. They all evolved from a common ancestor, which is something with two eyes. Plants and animals and even microbes have some common ancestor, and we have all common ancestors. All of us, all the things have a common ancestor many billions of years ago. We can talk about embryology and development, stages of development in the fetus, including like gill arches and a tail, which we don't use anymore, but we have these things. They become different structures as we develop, but they are derived from gills that were evolved, many, several 250, 300 million years ago, 350 million years ago. We also have this evidence in DNA and genetics, like DNA. All things utilize DNA. That's because DNA is derived from some common source. It was a common thing that everything used on this planet, and it's a common ancestor was derived using that information. And then the genetics, the code that we use, the codes are the same. So we have certain genes that code for the same structures, like the 5 digits on my hand. My dogs have 4 toes and then a 5th dew claw, which is their thumb. They have the same kind of genetics that code for those 5 fingers. We also have, we can talk about species distributions of biogeography. Fish don't walk around on land. Oh, well, they do. They're us. But I mean, that's a joke. But anyway, species distributions in biogeography have all these examples of, proof is in the pudding. You live in areas where your ancestors have evolved and lived and passed on those genes. So, for example, polar bears, they have a fat layer, and they have actually clear hair. They reflect light just like snow does, so they look white. But their skin is very dark, so they don't get irradiated. They don't die from radiation poisoning from being exposed to the polar sun. But if you go look at grizzly bears, which are a close relative of the polar bear, they have similar structures, but slightly different because they don't live in the poles. You get the idea. So there's some, or in North Pole, but there's some differences that evolved in response. We also have, things going. We observe evolution going on today in things like Let's see, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. That's the MRSA that you guys hear about, or the superbug. Now, obviously these aren't really bugs; they're bacteria, and they're not truly super because they kill people, and we cannot stop them because the antibiotics that we use to kill them, well, they've evolved a resistance. They evolved the ability to not respond to the antibiotics. That means it doesn't kill them. So we have this predictive power of evolution, the theory of evolution, as one of these evidences. It's a power of explanation. We know where MRSA came from. It explains why MRSA exists. So there's also things like the nested hierarchy of traits. When I'm talking about those 5 fingers or the 5 toes on a dog or whatever, we know that they are nested in a hierarchy. If you would draw like here, we have the beaks of these different organisms here. They are derived from, well, birds with beaks, obviously, from a common ancestor down here. They didn't just fall out of the sky from, suddenly a dog turned into a bird. You get that. There's no, the transition forms, and we'll talk about that. There's some confusion there. We have things that change due to their environment, like whales. Whales don't have, they still have 5 digits, but they have flippers, and they still have pelvises too, but they're really non-functional. Okay, so what does this mean? We do what we do as humans due to the result of evolution via natural selection. So, this is a very big idea explaining all of the diversity and what's going on in life. And this is connected to geology because this is derived from that whole process of watching how rocks change and et cetera. I mean, it's not like this was, Darwin didn't come up with it that day. It took him, 40 years, plus there are many other people working on it as well. So who was the first to connect this process of evolution to human understanding of evolution? Well, that would be the person I just mentioned. That's Charles Darwin. He was on the HMS Beagle, and he sailed in 1831, and he explored the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean. They went up the Amazon. They went around South America. They went through the Tierra del Fuego, went up to the Galapagos Islands, and he was looking at all of this diversity. And the observations that he was making in the Galapagos Islands, they countered the beliefs of his day. He observes that animals descend with modification from ancestral species. When he was in the Galapagos Islands, he recorded the presence of several species of these finches that you see up here, and they all looked fairly similar, except for their beaks were slightly different. And that brings us to this point, basically, why was this such a big idea? He noted when certain beaks looked a certain way, like here we have a tool-using finch, right, that is related to the mangrove the finch, close related to the insectivores, but they're different beak sizes, different. So each one of these tools that the birds are using serve in a different way. So they're beaks, but they serve to get different kinds of food. You have a vegetarian one here, you have one that uses a cactus over here. But he was noting all of these things. So he said, ground finches have deep and wide beaks. Cactus finches have these long pointed beaks to get in past the needle so they don't poke their eyes out. He said the warbler finches, so warblers have slender pointed beaks, so to get a specific kind of seed or insects in this case, but reflecting differences in their respective diets is what he was looking at. So he speculated that the finches had some common ancestor some form that had migrated to the islands from some other place. So close relatives of the Galapagos finches can be found, in the South American mainland. So he was right. I mean, he said, they must be close by, and they're found in South America. So you think of Ecuador, in a sense. And he looked at the variety of these forms adapted to different ecological niches from a common ancestral species, and this is a term, well, I don't think he came up with this term, but we term that adaptive radiation, which means you have one form enters a specific area. In this case, I'm going to get my pen. In this case, we have a common ancestor that was blown out. This is South America, right? Common ancestor of finch, these Galapagos finches, and it was blown out on the islands. And then the first island, there's probably several islands here, right? There's ground dwellers, they separated by different tree dwellers and everything else, but they also moved to the different islands depending on how they migrated. So they get different forms. There's different kind of plants. Plants are different. Different plants on each one of these islands, different kinds of food, and as they migrated, the ones that had the slight variation that increased their probability, their ability to pass on their genes, survived with those characteristics to pass on those genes with those characteristics to their offspring. And so you get change in beak length and beak size in relation to the finches. Now, obviously, when we talk about this, these beak differences have major consequences for the overall fitness of the birds over many millions of generations. Today, we call this the theory of evolution. Now, remember when I was talking about at the very beginning of class, the theory is not a hunch or a guess. And if you listen to Richard Dawkins' talk, he talks about that as well. So it's a different concept. Evolution is fundamental to the studying of the paleontology and life history revealed in the fossils and the biology and geology, earth sciences, medicine, all the stuff we do in ecology, all the stuff we do in environmental science, all of the things that we do related to living organisms doesn't really make any sense unless you understand evolutionary theory. Now, Darwin conceived of evolutionary change as happening in very, very small, infinitesimal small steps. He called these things insensible gradations, which means you can't even sense them, but there are some differences between each generation. And he said if you extrapolate these over a long period of time, that means expand them out many millions of generations, this would result in changes of the form and function for the whole species. So the whole entire species would change form over many millions of generations. And there's a mountain of evidence that support these small changes. These are called microevolutionary changes. You know, and I've already talked about one. The evolution of drug resistance is one of, we've documented this in many different microorganisms. It's pretty scary because unless we get a handle on this, you know, if we decide that we're not going to fund science because we don't believe in evolution, it's going to kill a lot of people because that's ignorance, and it's ignorance in its worst form. So we can infer from these changes that we see in the fossil record from species to species, because we don't see the small micro changes because we're not there actually observing them, as we call this macroevolution, which means this is the changes from species to species, but it's actually many thousands of microevolutionary changes, millions of microevolutionary changes that actually give rise to two different species. It's called a cladogenic event or cladogenesis. But they naturally are very hard to observe in action because we're looking at the fossil record. That said, you know, that they're hard to see. The mechanism of macroevolution can be seen in the here and now in the architecture of the genes. We can reconstruct some of these structures by looking at the genes, and when they, you know, there are Hox genes, which are these developmental genes we can look at. We also know that genes are involved into the day-to-day lives of organisms. They turned on or turned off, and they're connected to the way major features are governed. And so we can see this. We do a lot of this work in fruit flies, but we also see it in animals. We have the same kind of evolutionary changes in us, these Hox genes that fruit flies have. So they evolved very, very early in the evolutionary past of organisms. But we also see some very large everyday evolutionary effects, and we're going to look at some later on. But what I want to show you here is this is Darwin. You know, he's the sort of typical sort of senior scientist with the gray beard. They all had beards for some reason back then. I guess shaving, you know, it's not, we don't have the razors like we have today back then. And then of course, Sir Alfred Russel Wallace was his name. This is Sir Charles Robert Darwin, but anyway, Sir Alfred Russel Wallace also was observing changes in organisms just like Darwin was at the same time, but he was looking at biogeography. He's actually the father of biogeography, and along with being one of the people that came up with the ideas behind the processes of evolution, recognizing them for what they were. So they published their work in 1859, and they described the mechanism of change in organisms as natural selection or evolutionary change. Now be aware that organic evolution does not explain the origin of life on this planet. That's abiogenesis, and that's actually chapter 19 of the book. But organic evolution describes how living organisms have changed since they first appeared on Earth, right? It's a process going on where the information is actually what's changing, which changes what the organisms look like. Now, if you go back to what the concepts that were going on during these two gentlemen's lives, we basically have the the ideas of Aristotle and the book of Genesis that dominated the European culture of the time, which means animals don't change. They're sort of stuck in a specific form. All right, there's Platonic forms. Aristotle was also a part of that. Aristotle was actually a naturalist, but he studied, or Plato and Aristotle were cemented together in a sense that Aristotle knew what Plato was doing and was a student of his. And we looked at Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who came up with this idea that organisms inherit their characteristics from their parents, but these characteristics are acquired. So his term, he called it inheritance of acquired characteristics. And it was the first formal explanation of the theory of evolution, and it was taken seriously. So basically, it was the idea that if you're a giraffe and you're a short giraffe and you're a daddy and a mommy giraffe, you stretch your necks because there's a drought for whatever reason, and you're stretching your necks to get to the food because it's higher up, and your necks get longer, and then you pass this ability to stretch your neck onto your offspring. So basically, what he was saying is new characteristics arise in organisms because they have some need for that characteristic. And that need for that characteristic is passed on to their descendants. Now be aware that, this is a pretty good idea. It's not like he was a dumb guy. He was in the academy, the French Academy, French Scientific Academy, sort of like we have the National Academy here in the United States. But the idea that they arise due to their needs somehow didn't fit with Darwin's observations of variation, because he said, it's actually when we look at artificial selection and how organisms change in response to what humans are doing, you don't automatically pass on some genetics, or he didn't know what the genetic, you pass on some essence. I shouldn't say genetics, that's sort of jumping into the future, but you pass on some essence of this organism to your offspring. And he got this idea from reading Thomas Malthus's essay on populations. And it helped him formulate this idea that, natural processes select favorable variants for survival. That's why you sometimes have true breeding cattle and sometimes you don't, because there's some variation in there, and some of those variations aren't the variations that we want, but they're still there regardless. And so he said, there's something about this variation that's interesting to us in our ability to breed certain organisms, right? To be like of a breed of dogs or breed of cattle or breed of plants. Which leads us to, basically artificial selection. This is where Darwin was coming along and saying, okay, well, what are we going to do under, we have examples of, so here we have a wild mustard. This wild mustard, which is the, like French's yellow mustard that you see right here. You could grind that up and make flavoring out of it. It produced cauliflower through the breeders looking at specific traits that they wanted. Same with broccoli. It produced kale and it produced cabbage. It also produced Brussels sprouts for those that don't like. I love Brussels sprouts. My wife hates them, but you get the idea. A lot of people, and this actually goes back to the ability to taste bitter. We each of us has a specific tasting ability. The recessive trait is to be a bitter taster, which means you don't. The recessive trait is to be a non-taster, which means you don't taste the bitter. So if you eat Brussels sprouts, they don't taste bitter to you. Where if you're a dominant, and I'll talk about what this means in a second. If you're a dominant taster, which means you have both tasting genes active, and you end up tasting all of that bitter alkaloid chemical that's in these plants, and you go, ooh, this is really bitter, I don't like it. Okay, so some of the evidences that we talked about in biology will be mentioned here briefly, and so we're talking about the code of life, or deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, and it's shared by all organisms, like we said, and it's the artificial selection. The plants are expressing the code of life and getting some form as a result of that information. And it's contained within every single one of these plants, and it's passed on, but there's certain variation within that code in the whole population, not just one plant, but the whole population. So when you look at this, you got to keep in mind it's not just one mustard plant that's giving us this. It's a whole population of mustard plants, and there's some variation where one might look more like a cauliflower, one might look more like a broccoli when they flower instead of these kind of flowers where they're yellow. I mean, you can see that they look a little different. Actually, if you let this go to completion, they did here, so it looks a little different. These do flower up in a different way. These are little teeny tiny flowers, and they flower up, and They're not necessarily yellow though, but artificial selection is one of the best ways to understand the basic premise of how information contained within the DNA is passed on to mold future individuals, because we choose it. We decide which organisms are going to reproduce. But natural selection, on the other hand, it's not far-fetched to realize that the actual organisms are being selected upon for their survival. They're not actually being taken care of like domesticated plants and animals. But in this case, so I show this to my class, and it's on your computer screen, so it's a little easier to see. But I'm just going to go through this very quick. So the idea is that form follows function. Usually when you're looking at, there's a reason why, which means that the reason organisms look the way they do is because they survived, because they have the form or that follows the function, the survivability in this case. So if you look here, right here, this is a ground squirrel, and it blends into the background, which is, this is it looks like a granite, some type of granite rock with a bunch of lichen on it, and it has the same coloration. We also, going to the right, we have this giraffe right here that blends in with its background so the predators don't see it. And then down here on the lower right, we have a impala or a deer type. This is not a deer, but it's a deer. It's an ungulate, a hoofed animal that is preyed upon by predators. Now, be aware that the predator is being molded by this prey. And here we have a predator. This is a wolf, like we find up north. And the wolves blend in because if they don't blend in very well, they're not going to be able to eat their prey, which means they die. If they blend in really well, these organisms are going to be eaten, and they're going to have to, the ones that don't blend in, the prey that don't blend in very well, they're going to die as well. So you get the idea. This is sort of a race to see who can blend in the best. And then, of course, we have a very deadly snake sitting in the sand right here. Right, there's its head, the two eyes, and that's an adder. Very, very poisonous type of snake that lies around until it bites, till you come along and step in the sand and get bitten, and well, not you, but it can kill us, but it eats much smaller prey, stuff in the sand. But the idea is this: organisms in all populations possess heritable variations, and heritable is the key word here. They inherit, or they can pass on those variations. That means they're in the sex cells. So such as size, speed, agility, color, etc. And some of these variations are more favorable than others. That is, that there are some variants that give the organisms a competitive edge in reproduction to pass on those genes. If you don't survive to reproductive age, you don't pass on those genes, you get eaten, right? So you're passing on certain abilities like acquiring a resource or avoiding a predator, like I show here. Those favorable variations are more likely to survive in a population and be passed on to the next generation in that population. And so those favorable variations survive over extended periods, which improve the performance of the organisms in which the populations that they're in. And I love these pictures, so I'm going to go with this a little more. So up on the top left here, if you look closely, you have, these are easier to see because I think they're just easier to see. You have a Gyre falcon actually right there. We have a caiman, and I can't tell which direction this caiman. I think it's sort of sitting in here like that, right? And its snout is going this direction. And then on the lower right, we have the ptarmigan, of course, that blends in. We have an owl blending in with its background really well right there. And then, of course, we have, I don't see this is a nighthawk. So, oh, it's right here. And I think there's another one sitting right here with its back to us, if I remember right in this picture. But anyway, you get the idea. But then we have this idea that the survival of the fittest, and a lot of people, again, like I said, you have some brushes with ideas of evolution, but they're not really correct. Survival of the fittest doesn't mean these organisms are going to get all muscular, like they're going to get really big and be able to survive because they're really tough. That's not the idea. The survival of the fittest is basically, whatever works for you to pass on the genes to the next generation so you do survive. That's fitness. Fitness is the ability to survive to maturity and pass on your genes, those good genes that allowed you to survive to maturity, onto the next generation. And in some cases, this can be the smallest, or what we would consider the weakest. It's not really the weakest, but they can conceal themselves better. Or and sometimes it is the biggest and strongest. Think of elephants. they don't have to be fast because there's not a lot of stuff that can bring them down because they're so big, right? So having favorable variations does not guarantee that these individuals will survive and live long enough to reproduce, but it does increase the chance that they will. So it increases the likelihood that these favorable variations will be passed on to the next generation. Now, what gives us these characteristics? Well, Gregor Mendel was looking at pea plants, and it was the common garden pea, and we know they come in two colors. There's a sort of a purple. I've seen the purple ones, but there's purple or pink or red, and then the true breeding white or recessive. So when we talk about recessive, what we mean is we have this characteristic, a gene, something in the plant that is either going to be expressing a color or not. If it's a little a, it does not express a color, doesn't work for whatever reason. If it's a big A, it expresses a color. So we take a true breeding parent plant that is a recessive. In this case, it's called a recessive, right? And this one is called the dominant trait, which means it, and I'll explain that just right now. A dominant trait means that if you carry one of these color-inducing genes, which means you produce a color, you're going to be pink. And if you look right here, I'm going to circle them. If you cross these two white and pink or red pea plant, you're going to get all red, and I'll show you how. So the gametes come down. You have two A's up here. You separate them out. These are the gametes. So 1A can go there, 1A can go there, big A goes there. Same thing here. Little a goes there, little a goes there, big A goes there, big A goes there. So the big A, or the true breeding parent plant, the dominant one, gives one big A to every one of these individuals. So these genes, they didn't know what genes were. These are hereditary determinants. Something is carried in the organisms that gets passed on to the next generation. And he looked at how variation was passed on to the next generation. He came up with this idea that it wasn't just a blending response, that there's some information underneath all organisms that tells us what to look like. And these hereditary determinants, these genes, all this genetic information is carried in some of these cells, these chromosomes, these sex cells, and they're carried in chromosomes. And all of the genetic material that's in the sex cells, the chromosomes basically, is inheritable. It can get passed on. Now, obviously, we have sperm and egg in humans, and there's also, pollen and egg cells in plants. We'll talk about that. But in this case, it's a pollen and egg cells, and he was hand pollinating, and then he would clip off the reproductive structures of the flower so that he knew what was breeding with what. It was very controlled. Artificial selection in a sense. So we also have this modern view of organic evolution right now that's basically genes and chromosomes. This information is operated on by the environment, but it has to be in the sex cells. So I actually would look at this as the information that we contain is actually changes that have occurred in our parents. Our parents actually aren't experiencing these mutations that may increase or decrease our ability to reproduce, but they may have acquired them, but they don't actually express them, right? It's not in their bodies, it's in the sex cells that they pass when they pass these genes on to us. So sexual reproduction and mutations account for most of the variation in populations, and they has to be in the sex cells in order to be passed on to the next generation. Otherwise you end up with changes in, obviously we don't want changes in our somatic cells, that's what they're called. Rather than sex cells, they're somatic cells, which would be, cancerous growths or moles and things like that. But we know that we incorporate all this information now, and I do genetics in the lab all the time to explain how change happens with descent with modification over a long period of time. We've improved upon evolution to the point where, it's basically a fact, right? It's not something, when we talk about the theory, I don't know, we make observations all the time. It's a fact, like gravity going on all the time. So when we look at genetics, we discredit Lamarck's ideas because we understand that populations rather than individuals evolve, and we know the importance of natural selection for the evolution of animals. It's not, be aware that it's not the only thing. Natural selection is not the only thing, but it's the majority of change that we see is the inability of certain genes being passed on. Because organisms aren't a good fit. But there's also genetic drift and sexual selection, which I didn't really talk about, which is the size of antlers, because female mate choice will drive organisms in a specific direction that actually is not good for the population as a whole, but it shows the female that she's choosing a healthy male to reproduce with. So here we have, descent with modification. We have a group of species A that's going to give rise to species B and C at the bottom here. So, and the white, depending on natural selection, survival of the fittest, for whatever reason, the white frogs were selected out of the population. Either this could be a basalt flow, and so these are actually black frogs rather than purple, and this could be a forested area. And these were in an area where you have, sedimentary rock that's very light colored. You guys know what sedimentary rock is, rather than a basalt flow or forested area. And this white area gets covered by basalt. I mean, I'm making stuff up here, but you get the idea. And then all of the white frogs, since you get a lot of new growth on basalt flows over time, think of Hawaii, you end up with either a very dark colored background environment or a very green colored background environment, and then all the white frogs. Not a lot of snow. There is snow on Hawaii though. If you go up far, high enough and in the main island, they ski on, it goes up to like 12 or 13,000 feet. But well, what brings about this variation? Well, the first thing that you have to be aware of, there's some mutations. It's either chromosomal point mutation, some mutation caused some change in these organisms that all of these frogs may have been one color at some point, and in this case, for whatever reason, there's a whole bunch of white frogs, and then there's a mutation. You get a dark colored frog or green frogs here, and then they sort of get an equal mix here, and then the environment changes so much you end up with what we would call a cladogenic event. It's cladogenesis. This is cladogenesis, which means you're producing two species from one. It's a bifurcating network. It means two, bifurcating, to bifurcate. And then this change through time where you have all the species, this would be called anagenesis, which is just a slow change in a single population, anagenesis, over time. We know that mutations can be caused by chemicals, radiation, extreme temperatures, all sorts of things. But it's by chance alone, spontaneous. We don't know where they come from. We often can't even track it to a specific mutation. It can just be, mistakes when you're reproducing the DNA. Like sexual reproduction is also one factor that we get crossover events and strange things happen when you're making gametes that change the DNA as well. And we actually think that that's how sexual reproduction actually evolved, is because it increases variation. So sexual reproduction and mutations account for all this variation in populations. And then, we get genetic drift, natural selection, and all this material actually reduces variation in a population. In this case, you can have a variety of things going on. You might actually be, this could be organisms moving to a different environment, and this is actually the old environment. It actually didn't go away, and you still find green frogs and white frogs and black frogs in the original environment. It's not necessarily that they went away, but that's one way. This would be a variety of ways in which you can produce new species. Now, when we look at this, we look at speciation and the rate of evolution. Species are produced. This would be considered. So let's give you an example. Let's assume that there's this one range, meaning like one Brazilian rainforest, let's say, and you get a river separating this population just like this, right? It runs through the middle of it, and the white frogs go away for whatever reason, and actually the green frogs die out in this environment right here. They're already present in this environment for whatever reason, and you get two populations that are now separated by a barrier, which means they no longer exchange genes. No gene exchange across this barrier. No genes cross barrier, right? And that would be called allopatric speciation. Sympatric would be where, think of pollination syndromes where they speciate at the same point. You end up with two populations, two different species, but they're all sort of living in the same spot, which I guess you could say would be here, this is, competition genetically varied population. Eventually, over a long period of time, if there is no barrier, some of these populations, say the green or black frog is going to outcompete the white frog, and that would be sympatric speciation, meaning same area, same father, or same land in a sense. And then allopatric would be different land. So, whoops, that's kind of small. Let's go to this bigger one. So this would be a process by which we get new species forming. And depending on how many mutagens and other things are in the environment, you can create a lot of change rapidly. Now, when we look at possible causes of speciation for allopatric speciation, that's the barriers that we're talking about. And then we have this idea of phyletic gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. Now, phyletic gradualism is the movement of, or the change of organisms through time in a very gradual, slow way, where if you look at the fossil record, it's just very slow changes over many millions of years. But then we come across these areas where suddenly there's a huge diversity crops up. You get thousands of species in a very small area or in the fossil record over a short period of time, and that is termed punctuated equilibrium, which means there's all the sort of things aren't changing very rapidly, but then something in the environment changes that opens up some new territory, something like that. Think about it sort of like when amphibians came onto land. Suddenly they have all this land area to sort of explore, but they don't produce eggs that can survive on dry land. But then one of those amphibians produces an egg with a shell. Maybe not a very thick shell, but like a leathery shell, sort of like a crocodile shell. And suddenly they can move on to areas that are a little drier. And that opens up all these new niches, all these different places that these organisms can then evolve and fill. A good example of speciation and change going on right now we can see in something called Biston betularia, which is called the peppered moth. And the peppered moth is eaten by a bird called the great tit that you find in England or actually the British Isles, Great Britain. And so if you look, and you can see this fairly well on your screen because you're looking at it, but I asked my students in the face-to-face section, how many moths do you see? Well, and they usually can't, they can see the three, but this one that's really hard to see right here. This is one of the moths that's, blends in very well. And I try to explain to them, if you're a great tit and you're going to eat these things, the ones that don't blend in as well are going to get eaten rapidly. Now, this dark moth here, that still crops up in populations when they emerge after they've gone through, if they pupated and they emerge as full-grown moths. Every once in a while you get, 10% of them I think are these dark moths, and they get eaten very rapidly. But the dark moths still carry some of the variation, and they don't all die. Now, I want to draw your attention to this moth that we find on a tree that doesn't have any lichen on it. And this is one of the dark moths. Now, what you're looking at here is a term, or is the process is called industrial melanization. And it's industrial melanization, which means that the darkening of certain organisms in response to the use of coal. So this is obviously during the Industrial Revolution. There were no dark peppered moths per se. Now that's not to say that all trees are covered with this light colored lichen. It's actually a greenish hue. Here it's black and white film, but black and white photos. But all of the lichen responds very negatively to the presence of any pollution in the air. And so if you go to London, the trees, which originally had a bunch of lichen on them when we started burning coal, all the lichen died, and the trees turned, just bark colored, they're dark colored. And then if you go up to Scotland, and in fact, you'll see there's not a lot of industrial stuff going on up in Scotland, and the trees are still covered with this lichen. So if you go up to Scotland, you'll find this light colored moth. You go down to near London, you'll find this dark colored moth. They're the same species of moth, but they're going through a process of separation due to the different environments. Eventually, you can imagine if you went thousands of years, if humans were still doing this for thousands of years, the dark colored moth would dominate, and eventually the light colored moth wouldn't be produced because they would be changing so differently to the moths that you find up north. They wouldn't be exchanging genes as readily. Now, we actually see this in Michigan. You can go over near some industrial areas in near Detroit, catch moths, and you can catch the same kind of moths up north if you go up past Alpena or even further north up into the Upper Peninsula, and you can actually see them changing coloration in the same species of moth due to industrial melanization. We see it actually going on with our squirrels around Michigan. I mean, the fox squirrels. You'll go to areas where it used to be that we just grew wheat everywhere, and you had all these golden fox squirrels running all over the place. Well, before that, they were very dark colored because there were trees everywhere. We came down and cut all the trees so we could plant all these agricultural cereals, and then if you notice in Jackson, we sort of let the forest start just grow back because we haven't cut down a lot of these areas, and these areas that have been cut down we're letting grow back. And suddenly the squirrels are responding by, well, they're not getting eaten. They're not getting eaten by all the hawks and other birds of prey that normally eat them because they're of dark color and they're in areas that are more shady. So you get the idea. This is going on right now in Michigan. Example of evolution. But as Darwin said, he thought it was a very gradual process. When you look at, you get these micro changes that eventually lead to major changes. And here we have a ring species in warblers, which they're similar to the sort of warblers you would find on the Galapagos Islands, in the sense they sort of evolve in the same manner. But you have the original ancestral population of warblers. It's probably very similar to A right here. This is still a population, right? And single ancestral species of greenish warblers is thought to have originated at the southern edge of the Himalayas, and they moved north around the Himalayas in two different directions. And over time, this population exchanges genes with this population, which exchanges genes with this population, which exchanges genes with this population, which exchanges genes with this population. And going the same direction, this exchanges genes with this population, with this population, with this population. But when they meet at the top, E and H no longer can exchange genes. They're actually different species, even though they're exchanging genes around. It's called a ring species. And this would be a gradual process, and it's a gradual accumulation of minor changes throughout time. But then if you notice that the changes, when you bring these two species, as they change slowly around the Himalayas, you bring them up to the Tibetan Plateau, you bring them up around Mongolia, they no longer recognize each other. They have different songs, they do not interbreed, they don't recognize each other's songs, the wing coloration is different, and the genes differ, and the birds don't respond because they say, you know what, if we tried to mate, it wouldn't work anyway. And they're right, and that's basically how you get, new species developing in a very slow way. It's just a huge amount of time that we're dealing with when we look at the different kinds of, the rate of evolution. So, phyletic gradualism is a gradual accumulation of minor changes that brings about a new species. Or if you look at like punctuated equilibrium, there's little or no change for a long period of time, and suddenly there's this huge radiation of new species. They rapidly radiate from one area, and it happens in a very short amount of time, like 1,000 years. Now, don't be aware that punctuated equilibrium is controversial because some biologists say, well, we just don't see the gradual changes because they're not contained. Fossilization isn't like a common thing. Although there are a lot of fossils, it doesn't happen just all the time. Like even though we bury our dead, we're unlikely to become fossils. Even though we bury our dead in graves, they're unlikely to become fossils unless they're in the right conditions. We also have issues with plants. When they become species, they do this sort of, slow change or possibly punctuated equilibrium, but they also can go through a process that we call polyploidization or polyploidy, which means they get the doubling of chromosomes, and, it's also something that we utilize in artificial selection to give us better variants of wheat or corn so that they produce larger kernels, etc. So it's something that we use to our advantage, but plants change very rapidly due to they tend to have a simple body plan, and if you add more genes, it doesn't change them all dramatically. If we add new genes to us, since we're much more complicated, things happen like, trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. There's a problem with that. It's certain expression of genes can cause issues with the development of organisms, depending on, and depending on the types of genes that are crossed over during that crossover event. Some people with Down syndrome are quite fine. They live on their own. They have their job. They do their just like you and I. And some of them have more disabilities associated with the kinds of genes that are transferred or held over in the 21st chromosome. One of the things that I want to stress though is it's isolation or partial isolation of species, of one species that must facilitate the beginning of speciation, because you must isolate the genes in some way so that they can acquire changes or variation that in the other population, even though they're the same species, isn't acquiring. Eventually these add up so that they're a totally different type of organism. And this is leads us to this whole idea of divergence in organisms, that these are very small changes over a long period of time that gives us all the plethora of things that we see on the planet. So divergent evolution involves an ancestral form that gives rise to all of the species. So you can backtrack all the way to the very first organisms, were probably microorganisms billions of years ago, doing this, because it's a divergent process, or a convergent process if you go the other direction. So microevolution involves these little teeny tiny changes. So if you look at this, there are changes going on in a population, just like we saw with the birds. And they're changing in their geography, and these are little changes in the DNA, in the way they look. And it's through time here, but this also can be geographic space. Let's say there's a, you can also do it like that in a sense. And eventually, when they reach these points where you get major divergences, that means you're going to get something like it's the difference between a hyrax and an elephant or a sea cow here, right? These are different. These live near the ocean, right? These live in the savanna. Oops, savanna. Can't spell. Yeah, they're sort of acquiring changes very gradually, but that will we end up with wildly different organisms. But we're dealing with a huge. There's another N in here. Sorry, savanna. We're dealing with a huge numbers of years. We're talking millions of years. It's hard for me to even think about 100 years, which is a typical lifespan of a human, but we have millions of the lifespans of humans involved in these evolutionary changes over time in millions of organisms. So once we get above the species level and you've acquired all these changes, we term that macroevolution. So once you get above species level and you're looking at, genus or family or order or whatever, these are much larger groupings. So if you look at the horse and the hyrax, you can draw a circle around them and call them, you can call them, we call them, well, we call them ungulates. And I'm trying to think, the problem is hyraxes, they're not really considered ungulates. We have cetaceans, not whales, but yeah, whales are cetaceans, but I'm thinking porpoises. So porpoises could be included this as well, but you circle these. Elephants and sea cows are closely related. Hyraxes and horses are closely related. Camels and whales, and then deer and camels, etc. Where the horses, in this case, these are all in 3 dimensions. The horses and the deer are far apart, further apart than the whale and the deer, but we're actually finding that they're all ungulates, which means this sort of toad, this organism that has certain toes, certain structure to their toes, and they tend to use their middle toe. But yet we know that elephants, they have, there's one big foot there. Their toes are reduced. We know that sea cows originally were derived from ungulates. They originally were artiodactyls, or these sort of hoofed animals. But it's very interesting because that would be a macroevolutionary process. There's some reason above the species level that the outcome is survived through time because it's been successful. Like I talked about us having 5 fingers and other organisms having 5 fingers. Well, we're all derived from the same common ancestor to mammals, which you see here. They don't have humans on here. We could be put on here. We're related to all these things. This is a common ancestor to mammals in general. So there are other mammals that you could put on here, but these are all macroevolutionary processes. So successful structures that survive for the general environment survive through time, because if you don't have them, along with the other microevolutionary changes that occur, you're not going to survive. So obviously, if you have organisms born without legs, they aren't going to live very long because they can't eat. So if you have deer born without legs, because that's some mutation in their Hox genes to produce legs, then those offspring aren't going to survive to reproduce. So you get the idea that these are the going body plan from macroevolutionary changes, which are the additive microevolutionary changes, is pretty conserved over long periods of time because it's successful. Which leads us to this other concept called convergent evolution, which is organisms develop similar characteristics even though they're distantly related, because parallel evolution, the environment in which they live only allows them to be a certain way. So we have marsupial carnivores. They are extinct now. They were in South America. We have the saber-toothed cat. It's also extinct now, but these are not related. This is a marsupial and this is a mammal. But there's a place, think of it as a place in the ecosystem for these organisms to survive, eating the camels, the early camel and the camel-like Leptoptern, which was also found in relation to the sort of think of marsupials. And then you have the Toxodon and the early rhinoceros. This is North America and South America. Now you have the similar features for the common ancestor here. So these are distant related, but they are still related to a common ancestor down here, right? So there's still an overarching body plan where the mammals are actually derived later than these. That sounds kind of weird, but the marsupials evolved first. And the placental mammals, which is basically the marsupial pouch inside internal fertilization, we're just better at keeping our offspring alive because they're born almost fully formed rather than the way the marsupials are born, very rudimentary form, and they have to crawl up and get into the marsupial pouch in order to survive. And so we ate all of them basically, or we out-reproduced them, which is why you only find them in Australia. So because Australia was cut off before mammals evolved. That's the idea. So you have kangaroo rats and the jerboa, which are look very similar, but they are not related. They're not related to a common ancestor recently. And the idea here is that kangaroo rats and jerboas, they both get their water from their food rather than having to drink water. But kangaroo rats are found in the desert Southwest, and the jerboas are found in like Asia, China deserts, Mongolia, that area. So even though they are rodents that originally were derived from rodents that ate, that drank water and did all the drank water and did all the things that they were supposed to, not supposed to, I guess that's the wrong way of saying it, that they did in a wetter environment, even though they didn't derive their ability to get their water from their food resources from a common ancestor. They derive that independently because they live in the similar deserts. That's the idea. And basically for this, these are convergence due to similar ecological systems. This is parallel evolution in the sense that the common ancestor here had the ability to produce offspring or have mutations that allowed these organisms to eat their food and get all of their water resources from their food, but that didn't evolve until later on, which means they were now separated populations, right? There's divergence. They have similar features that are developing, but these basically this idea is called parallel evolution. They're paralleling in the sense that they're derived from a common ancestor, but their characteristics are parallel to each other. They have the same ecological requirements in a sense. It's very hard to tell the difference between convergent evolution and parallel evolution because this can often be relayed as simply macroevolution. There's something about the body plan of both these organisms that allows them to survive in similar environments, even though they're no longer exchanging genes because they do share a common ancestor at some point. So, but we do see whales and dolphins that entered the water at different time periods, still looking similar, but they're not derived from the same common ancestor, which means their common ancestors, although they are hoofed animals, they didn't enter the water at the same time. They entered at different time periods. And we represent these changes in using cladistic trees or cladograms, which is what I was talking about. They're bifurcating networks. And how we do that is if you look, all of the changes in these organisms can be mapped on one of the limbs, right? So you got vertebral column, so all vertebrates, we evolved a vertebral column, and then sharks evolved, right? And then sharks are cartilaginous, which means after sharks evolved, and we have, even though we're sharks, we are sharks, sorry, that's a mispronunciation. The ancestors to sharks evolved as one large population. There's a sector in this population, right, that bony bones started forming, bony fishes formed, right? So you got a bony internal skeleton, and you have the lungfish. There's lungs being produced here independently of lungs in other organisms, which is down this direction. You have gills in the placoderms, you get the idea. Four limbs evolved in the sense with the 5 toes or 5 fingers, just like we have today. And so everything this direction going up the cladogram now has 4 limbs, 5 fingers and toes. So we got the salamanders, we have dinosaurs, we have birds. Birds lose, because they're now flying, they lose a lot of those fingers. They're still there, they're present, but their fingers start fusing and stuff because of the nature of their ecosystem has changed. They're no longer running around on the ground. We get hair. Birds don't have hair, so they're not tracking up this direction. You got the possums, right? Those are marsupials. That would be all the marsupials we were looking at before, and then the placental animals form. You get the horses, the cats, and us, of course, we're up here as well. If you look at the change in form, the body plan, instead of doing it this way, mapping it, you can just draw big, huge circles around these kind of things to show the different body plans, right? That's what they're kind of showing you here. These can be big circles that you draw like this around, right? And then this circle is contained within the other circle. You get the idea. It's a nested circle. That was one of the nesting evidences for evolution that we're talking about. When you map characteristics, it's a nested hierarchy. So I show this to my students all the time. This is in the book. It's cladograms for dogs, birds, and bats. And you say, okay, well, we can just map these characteristic changes so that we know the correct form. So you would say, okay, well, dogs, this is hair, right? Which means you'd have to reverse for the bird for feathers, and then re-evolve hair again for bats, right? So that is 2 changes to get the same kind of development, or 3 total, because you had 3, right? Which is 1, 2, 3, 3 hatch marks. So then you could do, here we have hair, same kind of idea, formed, right? The birds lose it, they have feathers, etc. Dogs have to reform another step to get the hair again. Excuse me. You can see how this again is 3 steps. But then you have feathers, right? And hair. Both dogs and bats have hair because they're mammals. Rodents have hairs too. You can get the idea. So there are 2 steps here. So this makes more evolutionary sense because it takes 2 steps rather than the 3 steps to explain just hair as a characteristic on animals. Or, yeah, these are all animals. But and you can go through and map every one of these characteristics, and the one with the fewest steps is probably the best hypothesis for when you're trying to figure out when they formed. So when we talk about when organisms get certain characteristics, that's a real interesting, question. So here's an example of a bird fossil, possibly. I mean, it's a very famous fossil, okay? And, one of the objections that people had to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was the lack of these transitional forms. They said, what are the transitional forms if there's just one form and then there's another form in the fossil record? If you're talking about these microevolutionary events, you should have all of these different forms captured in the fossil record. Of course, we just know that fossils are rare. They don't just, every time something dies, does it become a fossil. So these forms would show that evolution how evolution was actually operating on these organisms. But we didn't really have these examples from one group of animals to another. However, it was like 1 year after he published The Origin of Species, people were in Bavaria near, it's think of like around Germany in a sense, because it's where we get them now. But they discovered, it is Germany, but they discovered, it was Bavaria at the time. That's the point. Um, we discovered these a feather basically sitting in one of these limestone layers, and that was like, and it was a feather from 150 million years ago. And then in 1861, which is this fossil, this is from Berlin. That's what it says in the copyright. But um, we discovered Archaeopteryx, which is a primitive sort of reptilian type of bird. It has teeth, has a long bony tail, but it has feathers. It looks like they could fly. We don't know if it actually flies, but it looks like it could fly. But it's probably a glider, or it might be for, sexual display, sort of like a peacock. We don't really know. But the assumption is based on the type of structures that the Archaeopteryx has, that it would probably be a glider. But anyway, it's commonly seen as the first bird, right? You get the idea that these are suspected as being dinosaurs, but it has feathers. But it's a bird. Okay, so, but then that says, well, there should be dinosaurs with feathers, right? And then Thomas Huxley said that this is probably, he was a colleague of Darwin, by the way. Thomas Huxley said, it's probably an evolutionary link between dinosaurs and birds. That's what they were speculating in 1861. And he speculated that, one day we're going to find dinosaurs with feathers. And in fact, that's actually what happened. In 1980, there were deposits that were found from the Cretaceous period. So that was this is about 150 million years old. They found some from 125 million year old deposits in China, northern China, if I remember right. And they were in abundance, all of these different forms, and they found things like Archaeopteryx alongside dinosaurs with feathers, with feather-like plumage. And so, we get the connection. This is what people were looking for. This is direct evidence of evolutionary processes going on in the fossil record. We have evidences from rhinoceroses, horses. The modern view of organic evolution says there are trends in mosaics in evolution, that we say increasing size, right? Development of horns, for protection. We think that evolution obviously is a two-step process, that you get these chance variations in an interbreeding population, and then natural selection, or nature, operates on this variation, which gives us differing structures that survive because they improve the chances of those organisms reproducing and passing on those genes, which leads us to extinctions. Extinctions is a natural process. Now, if you look at this graph, it looks kind of weird because it looks like, you normally read them from left to right, but in this case, we start at 0 and we go back in time. So if you go back to 542 million years, which is where we think multicellular life first started cropping up. Well, it's where it crops up in the fossil record, so that's why we talk about it. And then we look at when the types of these fossils appear, and the extinction. So there are some small extinction events, changing things related to what these organisms are going through. And then we have the big 5 major extinctions in the past, right? Obviously, we have a major one, which was when the dinosaurs went extinct, big one. We also have the 200 million. This is a huge one. 250 million years is actually the biggest. This is the Permian extinction. And you go all the way back, there's some huge changes that occur. But what's interesting about this is when you look at the extinction, when you look at the numbers of species when they drop, right? They're dropping here. They take about 1 million years for them to drop. So here we have, during the Permian extinction, we lost 75% of the organisms. During the when the KT extinction, when the dinosaurs went extinct, we lost something like up to 40% to 60% of the organisms were lost. And obviously the big dinosaurs were lost. But here's what's scary. Even though this is, extinction is a natural process, 99% of all of the species that have ever survived have gone extinct. But we also know that that's the natural process of change. And when we talked about anagenesis, which is just organisms changing through time due to changing environments, all species go extinct. But currently, today, here at ground zero, we are going through extinction at a rate that is about 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than the Earth has ever experienced before. We expect that we're going to lose 30% of our reptiles species and 30% of our amphibian species by the year 2100. So in about 200 years, we will have lost 30% of the species. If you were looking at the last extinction that would have been a 500,000 year process to lose 30% of a group of organisms. We should have taken 500,000 years. We're doing it in less than 200. So that's something to think about when we talk about the geological time scale, how big it is, and how new species arise and go away. And one of the concerns we have when we talk about global climate change and all these other things that we've talked about is, we are a species and we can go extinct. So here's some predictions that we get from theory of evolution. I'm not really going to go over it. Just find it in your book and you can look through it. There are a lot of predictions that we get from just the natural process of, making better medicines. We know that we can make better medicines. So we also classify based on nested similarity patterns of characteristics, right? Carolus Linnaeus gave us the first one, which is the, Linnaean system, which is breaking groups of organisms into genus and species. And based on shared characteristics. But if you go back, this is a nested pattern of similarities, which is why we're all related, because you can nest all of the similarities when you map them on the cladograms, right? So vertebrates all have a backbone. Mammals are all warm-blooded. They all have mammary glands, and genus level organisms share most characteristics, but only at the species level can they interbreed. So even though they share all these characteristics, only species can interbreed if we're using the biological species concept. And then, of course, I show you this picture, and this is one that I have on our webpage on JetNet. Evidence supporting evolutionary theory, we have structural evidence, biological evidence from structural comparative anatomy, right? The forelimbs of humans, whales, dogs, birds, are all superficially similar because they're all derived from a common ancestor. They're made up of the same bones with the same arrangement. The reason they change is because we're under different evolutionary constraints due to natural selection in the environments in which we live, which is nature. That's the selecting agent. So we also have this issue of analogous structures, which means even though we're utilizing this convergent evolution idea, we're utilizing the same ecosystem, we're not derived from the same common ancestor. Therefore, bats and birds and flies do not share a common ancestor. They're utilizing the same environment to serve some purpose, which is survival, to pass on their genes to the next generation. And I mentioned the dew claw in dogs. So they have 4 toes, that's what they run on those pads, but then there's the dew claw, which is their thumb in a sense, and it's a vestigial structure, which means vestigial structure basically means that it's a remnant structure that is no longer functional. It doesn't serve a purpose. Wisdom teeth in humans, pelvis in the whale, like I just showed you. These are all structures that are throwbacks to ancestral form that is no longer utilized in the current environment, which is most likely it'll just go away over time. It's not utilized. It's not going to give us some sort of selective advantage. Now, fossils, these are the things we're talking about. What do we learn from the past? Well, we can reconstruct environments. We know what they look like. We look at the shells, the bones, the teeth, and we can analyze how they lived, and we can correlate their structures to the type of environment. So we can look at global climate change using fossils. We can also look at, similar ancestral species to us. We can look at Australopithecus afarensis and know that it basically has the similar structures to us, but these are structures that are, several million years in the past. So fossils are very important for reconstructing past environments and looking at changes through time in basically hard parts, because those are things that fossils, but we are finding organisms that, these hard body parts, some some skin can sometimes be, the impression of the skin actually, it's not the skin itself, can be found in fossils. Shells and marine organisms were very good at reconstructing past ocean environments because they get covered pretty regularly by floods from streams, and most of their hard parts will fossilize. So we can reconstruct, and we can look at extinction events and things like that and reconstruct environmental conditions. It's the land animals that are also very important. And we also can say what's related to what. So we can look at the fossils, record the evolutionary changes, we can model these. So if you look here, these are all ungulates, the tapir, the rhinoceros, and the zebra. So if you were to draw a line, draw a line on here, and you could say hooves, right? But like I said, we have whales that are derived from hooved animals too. They have other structures. We can say, look, they're all related here. Rhinoceroses and zebras and tapirs. You get the idea. So they're hooved animals. What we see is there are different stages that organisms sort of take over and utilize the ecosystem because of evolutionary changes. And one thing that we often see in the fossil record is organisms, meaning individual species, last anywhere, usually about 1.5 to 2 million years, which is we're about at the limit of our evolutionary, for the modern human, we're about at the limit right now, which is kind of interesting. And we sort of might be experiencing all of these changes that we're promulgating it, but anyway, it means we're causing it. I guess promulgating is a big word, but we're causing it. And so if you see here, there's the age of the amphibians, right? We have the age of the reptiles. Now, it's interesting because the age of the birds and mammals overlap. But the diversity of birds, the number of birds, if you look, they're spreading out. This is like species numbers, right? Reptiles went through the KT, the KT extinction, which is right here. And the amphibians went through a major extinction. They survived it, but they're actually going through a major extinction right now. But if you look at this, we still have a majority of the organisms that were around that haven't gone extinct. Most of the organisms have some body plan that survived through time. And if you note, this body plan is connected to all of these organisms, right? Because they were derived from all of this body plan. The interesting thing is we see the same forms in similar environments through all of the different time periods. Obviously, they're not the same animals, but the same responses to changes in the ecosystem conditions, which is nature. And here's the big one. I want to show you, this is kind of a funky slide. It's not really picturesque, but evolutionary theory is as well supported by evidence as any major theory. In diverse fields of science, the evidence continues to corroborate evolutionary process. Scientists may disagree on the rates of evolution, significance of some fossils, and the details of the lineages, but we do understand that it is the cornerstone by which we understand how biological organisms have changed. So scientists understand that evolution is a process in nature, has nothing to do with us, and only our understandings of it changes. The process remains the same. Here's one interesting point that I need to make is today evolutionary theory remains open to modification and it's testable, but theories don't get rejected. Only hypotheses get rejected. When we test evolutionary theory, we do so via a hypothesis. And when that hypothesis gets rejected, we posit an alternative hypothesis, which still falls under evolutionary theory. So that's something that I find very interesting about how we view evolutionary process, which is something regardless of us, and going on outside in nature, and then thinking that it's just sort of a whim. It's not. It's something that's very huge. It's like, we can test gravity all the time, right? But it doesn't mean that if we understand gravity in a different way that gravity is going to change for us. Our understanding of it changes, but gravity's here regardless of how we understand it. It's still a process that's outside of us. So in summary, organic evolution describes how living organisms have changed since life first appeared on Earth. In 1859, Charles Robert Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace published their views on evolution and proposed natural selection as the mechanism for evolutionary change. Artificial selection of plants and animals by human breeders gave us a lot of, it's a lot of evidence for how organisms change through time. We have heritable differences which means we pass those differences on to our offspring. Some differences are more favorable than others, which increase the likelihood of those organisms that carry them to live to adulthood and pass on those genes to their offspring. So favorable differences are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Then we have Mendelian genetics that show us the process, the stuff behind the evolutionary change, which we later understood to be DNA, was what he was looking at, the DNA basis for organic evolution. And we know that extinction is a natural process, and then we have this evidence for evolution, which is, well, I'm not going to go through them again, but the evidence is everywhere you look and there's a living organism, that's evidence for evolution. If you can break down that, meaning look at the organism and use your ability to break the organism down into different characteristics and look at those characteristics are related to other organisms. And it turns out to be, a nested hierarchy, etc. Well, this concludes chapter 18. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a much longer lecture because I wanted to be very pointed in this lecture because it's one of the most misunderstood processes in nature when we talk about evolution and what people know about it. Thank you.